from the evil one. The Gospel of the Lord. Well, Jesus gives us a number of commandments today about how to live. And when the world sees commandments, the world is not a big fan of commandments, because a commandment is something that puts a requirement on us, right? It requires something of us. And so, think about the commandment to love our neighbor, that commandment to provide for the needs of the poor. When the world hears that commandment, it says, now wait a second, we've got to take care of ourselves, right? Don't do this, whatever this charity thing is, right? And so a commandment can sometimes be seen negatively because it's requiring something of us. But, in particular with that commandment to love the poor and provide for them, we know as Christians, we see it differently than the world sees it. We know that when we give of ourselves, when we sacrifice of ourselves, that we're actually enriched by that, right? We're spiritually enriched by giving of ourselves and giving of our gifts. And so I mentioned that to draw your attention to the annual diocesan appeal. We've got envelopes in our pews, and this is the appeal that comes around every year. That is, majority of it goes to Catholic Charities to provide for the mission of the church, to provide for the poor. And I think it's a great way to follow that commandment of the Lord, to provide for those that are in need and really make a difference in people's lives who really need that. Another reason that the world doesn't like commandments is because a commandment is something that tells us how to live, and it's something that can sometimes even be considered a form of manipulation, right? Sometimes you'll hear this in the world that, the rules or the commandments, right? They're just a form of religious manipulation to try to get people to live a certain way or to take away their freedom. And so they're seen as something that restricts us or something that sort of diminishes us. And so Jesus says these things today that are difficult, that are hard. Don't even say, you fool, to your brother, right? Or don't look at a woman with lust. And he says things about marriage and divorce and all these things that are seen as a restriction or something that sort of takes away from us. And so, what is a commandment? Because if a commandment is just a burden, just something extra that's sort of added onto us, then, what good really is it? But we know as people of faith that if those commandments are coming from God, then they must be something good, right? They must be something that is truly good. And so what are the commandments? What are they all about? Well, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it talks about the commandments, and when it talks about the commandments, it talks about them as a revelation of God. I think it's such an interesting way to think about them. It says that the commandments belong to God's revelation of himself and his glory. The gift of the commandments is the gift of God himself and his holy will. In making his will known, God reveals himself to his people. Right, so those commandments, they're a way that God is revealing himself to us, because you think about, what does a commandment do? Well, a commandment tells us how to live a good life, right? It teaches us how to be truly good. And so a commandment, every one of those commandments is kind of like a little pencil mark, right? It's like a little sketch, and when you put all those commandments together, it gives us this sketch, this image of the face of God. Right? It reveals to us who God is, because it shows us what it means to be good, what it means to be holy. And so all of those commandments are pointing towards that highest good, which is God, right? It's revealing to us his face. And so similarly, it makes sense then that when we follow the commandments, when we allow our lives to be sketched according to that same pattern, then we become like God, right? We start to reflect God. We start to reflect the mercy of God, the goodness of God, the love of God for others, his patience, all of those things, right? Whenever we follow the commandments, we're sketching our lives according to that image of God. And remember that each one of us has been created in the image and likeness of God. And so we're called to that fundamentally by who we are, to follow those commandments and to live that image and likeness that we've been created in. And conversely, whenever we fail in the commandments, when we sin, we're obscuring that image of God, right? We're sort of blurring over it a little bit. And I think it's important to realize, when we say that we're sort of blurring over the image of God, or we think about sin, sometimes we think like, oh, I just don't quite have the polish or the shine that I should have, and that's too bad, right? But think about this, that if we've been created in the image and likeness of God, if that's essential to who we are as human beings, then that means that when we sin and when we cover up that image of God, we're actually becoming less human, right? We're becoming less human. We're becoming something sort of diminished. We're kind of deteriorating whenever we are walking away from the commandments. And so you can see why Jesus in this gospel passage, it seems like he's so deadly serious about sin in this passage, right? He's so strong with his language. He says things like, if you say you fool to someone else, then you're going to be liable to fiery Gehenna. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. Jesus says it's better for you to lose everything that is good on this earth than to end up in Gehenna, right? And so Jesus presents to us this place of Gehenna, this state of total and definitive separation from God. And he says, that's a real possibility for us. He's being so strong. He's saying, listen, this is what happens, right? If we fade away from who we've been created to be, then we're going to drift farther and farther away from God. And it's not that every sin that we commit is going to separate us from God, but every sin that we commit is going to distance ourselves a little bit more and more, and sometimes that can lead us to separate ourselves from Him. But the reality is, that God has given us this tremendously powerful gift of free will, and with that free will, we can choose to follow the commandments and to grow more and more in the image and likeness of God, or we can choose to ignore those commandments and we can start to deteriorate and we can start to become something that cannot stand in the presence of God. That's what that first reading from Sirach said. It said, before man are life and death, good and evil, whichever he chooses shall be given him. Right? Whatever he chooses shall be given him. And so really God has given us the choice between heaven and hell. Right? Those are the ultimate and definitive states of the human soul, right? We can end up in heaven or we can end up in hell. And it's something that's really up to us whether we accept the commandments of God or we don't. But thanks be to God, obviously there's always good news, right? The good news is God doesn't always just give us immediately what we want, right? And you think, who would, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, who would even choose hell over heaven, right? Why would we do that, right? But, if you think about it, if I look within myself, don't I find that so often I decide that I want to choose darkness over light and that I want to choose my own way over God's way, right? And so it is possible for us to choose hell over heaven, but thanks be to God, again, that God does not always give us what we want right away, right? He says, okay, why don't you just think about that for a while, right? He gives us this opportunity to change. He gives us this opportunity to repent. He gives us this opportunity to come back to Him. And He gives us the sacrament of penance, that sacrament so that we can receive His mercy, so that we can be forgiven, and so that God can place us back on that right path, so that He can place us back into relationship with Him. And so that's the whole reason that God sent His Son Jesus down to the earth, so that we could be saved from sin, so that we could be saved from hell, so that we could be restored to that life that He desires for us, and that we can grow in holiness, right? Jesus is there to teach us what it means to live as the image and likeness of God. He teaches us how to sketch our lives according to that pattern of God. He teaches us how to live those commandments with our whole heart, so that we can grow in holiness and spend eternity with God in communion with Him in heaven.